Grüezi miteinander, ganz herzlich willkommen und einen wunderschönen guten Tag, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde. Ich darf Sie begrüßen einmal mehr aus Sotschi, von diesem zauberhaften Hochplateau in den Gebirgstälern des Kaukasus, unweit der georgischen Grenze, hier inmitten des einstigen Olympiageländes der Winterspiele von 2014. Und hier findet eben die 21. Waldai-Konferenz statt. Ich habe Ihnen darüber schon erzählt. Das ist ein Zusammentreffen von führenden russischen Wissenschaftlern, Akademikern, aber auch Diplomaten, Politikern, und es werden auch ganz bedeutende Gäste, noch Schwergewichte erwartet im Verlauf der nächsten Tage. Unter anderem sind angesagt, angemeldet der russische Außenminister Sergei Lavrov und der Chef persönlich, Wladimir Putin. Alle Augen natürlich auch auf die Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika gerichtet. Und wir fangen hier natürlich auch die Stimmungen ein. Wie sehen auf der anderen Seite der Welt die Leute die Vorgänge in den USA? Und vor allem, was werden dann am Mittwoch und am Donnerstag, so denn die Amerikaner rechtzeitig die Stimmen auszählen können? Ist ja alles andere als gesichert. Vielleicht müssen wir ihnen noch ein paar Wahlhelfer aus der Schweiz schicken und ein paar Schuhschachteln, wo sie die Stimmen unterbringen können. Aber wenn alles nach Wunsch abläuft, dann werden wir hier also auch Ihnen Einschätzungen bringen können von den beiden momentan sicherlich dominierenden Politikern in Russland. Aber die Konferenz ist eben auch interessant, weil sehr viele andere Leute da sind und nicht nur aus Russland. Wir haben sogar ein paar Europäer, ein paar Westler dabei, allerdings sehr wenige. Wir haben Gäste aus Südamerika, aus Asien, aus dem Mittleren Osten, aus allen Herrenländern. Und heute, jetzt hier, mein Gast ist ein ganz spannender Mann. Wir haben ihn in der Weltwoche sogar schon einmal interviewt. Er ist in Genf unter anderem tätig als Hochschullehrer für internationale Beziehungen und Entwicklungspolitik. Und ich hoffe, dass ich seinen Namen richtig ausspreche. Mein Chinesisch, my Chinese is not really up to standard, Professor, apologies. Aber ich versuche es richtig auszusprechen. Es ist Professor Xian Lanxin. Was this more or less correct, Professor?
Ausgezeichnet, ja.
Okay, und er hat mir erzählt, er sei über Genf hierher geflogen und so trifft man sich in den kaukasischen Bergen zum Gespräch über den Frieden. Jetzt werde ich natürlich auf Englisch wechseln, weil eben Chinesisch, das wäre ein bisschen schwierig hier in diesem Programm. Professor, you had a very interesting debate this afternoon, but I will start with a general question everybody has, especially in the West. Do we have to fear China? Is China the dragon on the rise, trying to get the world in its claws? Please enlighten us, Professor Xian.
Well, I think the fear of China coming out of Western culture, from the Western perspective, I think for two things I can think of at the present time. There is kind of anxiety about China. One is coming from this fear of Western decline, which was very much deeply rooted. That sentiment was deeply rooted by the German philosopher, Oswald Spengler's famous book on Decline of the West. And the second thing is also a tradition coming from Germany, which is known as a yellow peril, which is a German Kaiser and many others used to, use this against Asians. Now, this is the sentiment which is now widespread, especially in the United States, because the United States is considered itself number one, and it should not be surpassed by anybody. This is also known as American primacy theory, that China is the only one, according to American government, that has intention, capability to outpace United States to take over the U.S. position in the world. Now, this is the sentiment, but the reality is that, first of all, there is no historic evidence that Chinese ever interested of becoming a world leader, or let's say they become a dominant power beyond Chinese cultural sphere. There is no evidence. Chinese had the world's strongest navy in 12th century. We all know the famous expedition, to the oceans and so on. But they end up doing nothing. If we were thinking the same way as Europeans, then forget about Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and so on. So, we have been dominating the world since then. So this is, of course, there is no historic sentiment for Chinese to dominate. Secondly, I think if you want to take over American position, let's say, assume, you also have to take over a lot of responsibilities. To the least, you have to be a police of the world, meaning you have to build, dozens of military bases, spend a lot. U.S. military spending is 3 times more than China. So as you can see, Chinese have no intention why they do that.
What is if this is a misconception, what would you say is the primary goal of China, of the Chinese government regarding international relations? What do they want?
Well, I think they want 2 things, which one is they want to recover what they considered their rightful space. Now, what is the rightful space? Well, the rightful space means the Chinese international position before the British invasion of China in the 1840s, before the Opium War. Now, at that time, Chinese GDP in the world, in the proportion of the world GDP, according to OECD massive study, at that time, I'm talking about 1830s, is about 32.5% of global GDP. Now, because of the foreign invasion and all the reasons, we experienced what the Chinese called 100 years of humiliation, which is true, not just politically. We've been invaded by so many countries, including Japanese, and a civil war, but even more so, we had experienced a free fall of our economy. When communists took over, 1949, Chinese economy probably a little bit more than 1% of the global GDP. So as you can see, that's a real serious decline. So under the Chinese regime, after during the reform, the economic takeoff, the speed is very. It's causing a lot of concerns. But remember, we are still less than 20% of the global GDP. But the whole world, including the Western world, is already talking about Chinese takeover. It's absurd.
Yeah. So you have been much more powerful in economical terms. You mentioned it before. There are concerns. They say, well, you have this Belt and Road Initiative in China. This is a way of subtly, embracing the world, but also taking the world under control. What do you say to these voices? Unfortunately, we hear them also in Switzerland, in neutral Switzerland, even in the government, which is not good news. But what is your answer to that? What do you say to these concerns? They might be also legitimate concerns, because the people think a powerful country will always use its power to maximize. What do you say?
Well, I think the using financial power or using economic power, expanding into, let's say, what we call third world, or the less developed world, that is not China's invention, of course. This is invented by Europeans since the 19th century. And also, Europeans invented the approach to use infrastructure construction as the leading power, expanding themselves into the third world, Africa, Latin America. At that time, of course, is canal building, railway building. Okay, you think about all these railways building during the late 19th century. And so it's nothing new in history. When you have a sufficient economic power, you want to expand your market and so on. But there's one difference. which Europeans or Westerners are thinking in their experiences, which is a colonialism. You know, Belt and Road is a project of global expansion, for sure, but without colonialism. Colonialism means you have to send your people to permanently settle and take over other countries' territory beyond your cultural sphere. Okay?
And tell them what to do.
Yeah, tell them what to do, command what they want to do. But there is no such thing there. No such thing. We may have a diaspora, some business people, Africa, elsewhere, but there is no colonialism. The so-called neo-colonial charge of China accusations, totally wrong.
What do you think about this theory? China went through hell in the 19th century and even in parts of the 20th century. You have been invaded by Westerners. There was your experience of opium wars, colonialism, even the Germans against the yellow peril, the Wilhelminian Germany. They went into it. You had also a terrible time during communism. There was a lot of poverty in your country. Is it fair to say that the main goal of the Chinese government today is to secure the well-being of its people in material terms, so that we have to judge the politics of your government as, secure the livestock and the survival and the good life of its citizens? Is that the priority number one?
Yes, there is no doubt about it. This has been the logic of Chinese politics, I'm talking about throughout of history, including our ancient, imperial, time with emperors. External conquest, let's say, external conquest has never been the theme of the Chinese empire, even during the history. As I said, we had the biggest navy. We didn't do anything to take colonies. But also, remember this, Chinese had this long tradition of believing you cannot change the culture, or let's say outside world, which is not part of your cultural sphere. Okay, it's never going to work if you want to impose something on a totally different culture.
But how do you see the conflicts we have today, for example, the border conflicts with India, or even, there is a history, China was for 600 years in Vietnam. The Vietnamese, they're still very proud. They could send the Chinese home. How is this to be seen in your history?
Well, remember, with India and Vietnam, the territorial disputes, or also with Russia, but India and Vietnam territorial disputes are the colonial legacies of European colonialism. With Vietnam, the Vietnamese want to stick to a certain claim of the French ruler. India, the foundation of the Indian argument, it's a treaty what the Chinese government at that time was forced to sign with the British authorities. That's 1913. It's called the Shimla Agreement. So the Indian become an independent country. They stay with that claim. So these are the historical legacies, colonial legacies. Of course, Chinese have a reason to reject some demand, but so far, I would say, so far so good.
What
they
about
managed to resolve, both in Vietnam case, we had a Tonkin agreement with Vietnam, which was very successful after that little war we had in the 80s. But with India, we just had a wonderful treaty, a wonderful settlement just recently.
Before we go to your speech here about the Russian-Chinese relationship, very fascinating topic, one last question. Also a big concern in the West is Taiwan. And the narrative in Europe, in the United States, is that China somehow is provoking tensions. What do you say to that? The Taiwan issue, will it be a war? Will we jump into a war because of that?
Well, yes, there is a prospect of a military confrontation, but the reason is not what the United States or Europe were thinking. I think it's first of all, Taiwan issue, the tension over Taiwan Strait is pretty much brought out by the U.S. government. There is no doubt about it. The reason is very simple. The reason is very simple. We had almost 45 years of relative stability over Taiwan Strait because of one instrument United States and China agreed to maintain stability. That is the strategy which invented by Henry Kissinger. It's called the strategic ambiguity. Meaning United States oppose force for unification Taiwan, but the United States will keep that option under the table. They will not tell you what we do, but we have the rights. That's what U.S. Says. We have the rights to react if you do something. Now, with Biden administration, it's totally different. And Biden said 5 times. The first time we think it's a mistake. No, he's repeated 5 times saying, we will do it. So strategic ambiguity is changed into strategic clarity, means war prospects become more real at this moment. Chinese cannot retreat on Taiwan question, yes.
You're hoping for Donald Trump now?
To some extent, yes. Donald Trump doesn't give too much care about the Taiwan. He understands the difference between mainland China. You see, the biggest mistake for Europeans and also Americans, they are equating Ukraine problem with Taiwan problem. This is the biggest, I will say it's a strategic miscalculation. Europeans don't know what they're talking about, really. Europeans try to say, Chinese should not do it. If we do it, we're going to do it. You do what? Is European going to send ships to help defend Taiwan? Europeans cannot do anything. They basically, blah, 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 follow American. This is a wrong analogy. Taiwan issue has nothing to do with the Ukraine story.
Is the Ukraine war somehow a historic inevitability in the sense that the West was pushing the NATO ever closer to the border of Russia, and there was some point, the breaking point you could say, where Putin had to do something in order, otherwise he probably had to witness American nuclear rockets on the Red Square. Is there a certain element of historical inevitability about this conflict? How does China look at this terrible situation?
I think China is sympathetic with the Russian reaction. I don't think China particularly like this idea of a large-scale invasion of whatever they call it. But the point is this: what China is sympathetic with Russia because they disagree with the West how to define what they call the rules-based international order. And now China realized the Western country treat Russia the way, basically saying, it's our rules, it's our order. If you break it, it's your problem. Right? So now, if that is the case, you cannot deal with the West on security issues. You cannot rely on them, even making a deal with them, because they don't take your security interests into consideration. This is, I think, Mr. Putin said many times. Russia and China, both, they have been bent backwards, try to accommodate what they call the existing international system, since the end of Cold War at least. They want to be in the system, integrate into it. It is the American side who abandoned the system to begin with. Right?
Is there a conflict today between the so-called rule-based order and the value-based order? My impression is that some countries, let's say from time to time the United States of America, they say it's our values. And with their values, they say the rules no longer apply to us. How do you see that? Value-based order versus rule-based order?
They try to merge these into two things into one, but it failed already. Because you look at Biden administration when it came to power, they defined 21st century international relations as democracy versus autocracy, which is a huge mistake to begin with.
Why?
Because that exactly they're based on the value. They say one part of it. So they tried several times, so-called democracy, a summit of democracy. None of them really successful. Produce almost nothing. No. But even more fatal blow to this argument is the Israeli and the Hamas war. Now, on that issue, you see, supposedly you have a democratic regime, not only loves to have military confrontation. I'm not even sure could be a major suicide, the genocide. A lot of things break international rules, UN and so on, doesn't matter. Americans still more or less behind it, still sending weapons. Now, you're telling the majority people of the world, not just the global south, you tell absolute majority of the world, it makes no sense, that kind of so-called value-based.
You are working in Switzerland. You know the West. You know Western intellectual academics. You follow the debate since many times. According to you, what is the problem of the Western civilization at the moment? What is the problem of the West? How do you see that? Where does the West go wrong at the moment?
Well, my own view is actually very simple. It is the European Enlightenment that has led Europeans into an astray, into the wrong road. Europeans create something which is very good, Chinese would fully agree with, that is the Italian Renaissance concept. Remember the first encounter between China and the Europeans during that period, the first missionaries coming from Italy, Matteo Ricci. Now, what Matteo Ricci says, Chinese system is one of the best governing system at that point, right, 15th, 16th century, and they really studied Confucianism and so on and so forth. European problem is after Enlightenment, Lumière, they have gone to extremism, absolutism. We are the one knows everything about development of the economy. We are the ones, we have the best governing system. We are the, unbound Prometheus, as they say. The rest of the world are much lower. So Europeans, during the Enlightenment, they create a worst conceptual framework. Is dividing the global people into categories of races. Okay, that start ranking races. This is what worries me now, is the yellow perils come back, which is real. For me, it's totally real. So Europeans need to reflect on what's wrong with Enlightenment. I'm not saying nothing is good for Lumière, but there are a lot of fundamental things. Absolutism, political absolutism, psychological and value, absolute value, and so on and so forth. They have to reflect on this. There are only a small group of European philosophers began to think about this, which I'm talking about are the postmodern, historians and the philosophers, starting at least with Wittgenstein and the many others. But the majority are still following that logic. We are the best system, we're the best in everything. So therefore, there is nothing you can really talk to them. There's difficult to even have a conversation with Europeans.
Fascinating. The god of reason on the side of the Europeans. I mean, there were the German romantics who challenged this too. They say the absolutism of reason is probably misguided. You have mentioned something this afternoon which was utterly fascinating. You were describing the marriage between the bear and the dragon, between Russia and China, which nobody thought possible because your countries, China and Russia, are age-old rivals. You mentioned many conflicts, many wars over nothing. What's the secret behind this new alliance, behind this new friendship? How lasting is it? Or is it just, two partners which are totally mistrustful of each other, doing together for some time? Describe this relationship, and it's probably the fascinating aspect of it.
Well, yes, it may start as a marriage of convenience, because after the Cold War, Russia was pushed into a very difficult situation. They are looking for the potential new partners, who can. But I think under Mr. Putin, at least last 20-some years, there is something realistic, quite practical on the Putin side, that is to resolve real issues between the two countries. That is a territorial dispute. Now, so I think the Russian side initiated, Chinese side welcome. They patiently did it more than 20 years or so. They resolved almost 80,000 territorial disputes, which is extremely important foundation for two countries to solve their bilateral problems, just removing the source of conflict. Now, that's one thing. The second thing, of course, is global geopolitics. It is the United States, it looks to me, since the new century at least, steadily choosing to squeeze the power of Russia at the same time try to restrain China. So it's a containment on both countries. So it's only natural. It's only natural these countries getting together. The third thing I think is obviously there is a compatibility of their economic activities. Russian actually can sell almost anything if they have, the Chinese would love to have, which means, energy products, mineral, of course, if they want to sell advanced weapon system, everything. And the Chinese can sell everything that the Russian would need, manufacturing products, food and, consumer products. So it's a very compatible, it's a rare situation where two countries' trade patterns are compatible. So that's, I think, they create a very solid foundation now. Neither side want to give up that achievement.
We're talking a lot about Eurasia here at Waldai Conference. Eurasia means Europe is also part of Eurasia. It's the western part. What's the role of Europe in tomorrow's world? Where do you see this continent who has a lot of problems at the moment, this part of the world? Where is it heading to, or where should it go?
Well, for me, if Europe become a serious global player, let's say one of the major pillars in the multipolar world, they need to do one thing, which they failed to do, at least since the Ukraine war. That is to maintain or strengthen what they already created, the phrase called strategic autonomy. Okay. I think von der Leyen came to power as a Commission president, and that's where she said, I want to be, the president for strategic autonomy. But then they changed their mind. Could be American pressure, could be the miscalculation or wrong reaction or excessive reaction to the war in Ukraine, because they refuse to see their part in that war, the origins of that war, like NATO enlargement, like many other issues. Europeans are also behind it. I mean, don't forget, it's not just Americans doing NATO enlargement. And so this is, I think, so they refuse to admit their own mistakes, and they only follow the United States blindly on the issue of China, on the issue of Russia. So who can take EU here seriously? Neither Russia nor Chinese. Chinese actually give extremely high priority just before the war in Ukraine. Somehow EU become #1 on the agenda just for a while at that point. We are very close to have an investment treaty, remember, at that point. But suddenly, Europeans changed their mind.
What about Switzerland?
Switzerland is a unique case, I think. My view has always been abandoning some part of a neutrality is a mistake. If you do that, who is going to believe you will continue to that? Now, I cannot believe Switzerland will do anything militarily if we, let's say we meeting China, had something to do, some confrontation over Taiwan. But if they begin to adopt a biased attitude let's say it's total support of the U.S. position, then you lose neutrality, at least from Chinese or maybe Russian point of view. So I think Switzerland has to be, my view is, has to be very, very careful to stick to your own national origins. Switzerland is a country, to me, very much, I like Switzerland in the sense it's free but with real good order. That's an ideal country if you think what Confucius would like to have. I personally even studied the Confucius philosophy, probably during Renaissance also influenced Switzerland at the beginning. That's Albrecht, the famous philosopher, a German, who's, I think is the first one, Ökonomische Gesellschaft, right? That was, who founded that organization in Switzerland. So I wish Switzerland maintain its neutrality, maintain its control. Immigration issue, I think Switzerland have done pretty good so far. Therefore you don't have a big crisis. So, yeah, that's my view.
Let's have a final look into the crystal ball, and the meetings go on here at Waldai. What is the world ahead of us? Are we entering a new absurd version of the Cold War, or is this multipolar world of power, balance of power, is this going to happen, a more pluralistic world? What's your take?
At this moment, before the U.S. election, okay, so I'm even more pessimistic. It's not a Cold War 2.0. It's worse than that. It is a situation more similar to 1914 rather than the Cold War, the original Cold War. The reason is very simple, especially with Chinese-American relations or U.S.-Russian relations. Cold War has a clearly defined, or they managed to establish mechanism of preventing a hot war. And it's very successful in the end. Cold War only see hot war in Asia mostly, right? Korea, Vietnam, but the two superpowers never really come into the conflict. These days, there is zero, sorry to say, nil mechanism. Let's say even Taiwan, they destroyed that little thing, the strategic ambiguity that has worked. So there is nothing there can help either side to make a decision. So if the Chinese side decide to do something, there is no deterrence.
Where is the silver lining? Where is the beam of hope?
Beam of hope will be the American election results lead to some real adjustment, either by Trump. Now, Trump would do more radical things, but Trump is good on one thing, which I think will work. He doesn't give a damn to the concept of democracy versus autocracy, the ideological value thing. So at least we can make a conversation. China, Russia, maybe United States. So that is the beginning. And Trump loves summit diplomacy. May work. We never know. Or no, Harris, in Harris' case, I believe, if she can get her way, the so-called progressive Democrats she represents and her team represents, I happen to know some of them. Now, I will say, if they can get their way, they will also do some interesting modification. In any case, I do believe Bidenism or Bidenist foreign policy is over, no matter who is in power. No matter who gets to the position, they will have to abandon or modify democracy versus autocracy kind of foreign policy framework. That's what I mean.
This sounds at least like some half silver lining at the horizon, that there will be some adjustments. Professor, many thanks for this conversation, for your enlightening, for your Lumière, for your enlightening remarks hier. Meine Damen und Herren, sehr interessant hier mit Professor Xian zu sprechen. und wir werden das natürlich alles auch übersetzen. Ich danke Ihnen für die Aufmerksamkeit und es ist einfach faszinierend, hier diese unterschiedlichen Perspektiven einzufangen. Wir sind jetzt gespannt, wie es weitergeht und halten Sie natürlich auf dem Laufenden und gegens Wochenende hin dann wird hier die Erde beben, wenn da die ganz großen, ja, die Mastodonten gewissermaßen der Weltpolitik einfahren. Alle sind schon in dämonischer Gebanntheit. Stehen Sie diesem Ereignis, sehen Sie dem entgegen. Ich danke Ihnen. Bleiben Sie dran. Bleiben Sie trotz allem zuversichtlich. Ich glaube, I still think reason will prevail and the people want to cooperate. Ich glaube, die Vernunft setzt sich durch. Die Leute, and you know, as a famous British historian said, the people are smarter than their leaders. Die Leute sind oft klüger als ihre Führer. Also wir beide sind es sicher. Ich danke Ihnen ganz herzlich. Nein, Spaß beiseite. Ganz herzlichen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Aber ein bisschen Schmunzeln beim Anblick der Apokalypse muss ja auch erlaubt sein. Ich danke Ihnen sehr herzlich, wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Tag. Wir melden uns zurück.
Vielen Dank.